2, 1.
Good evening, everybody. Evening, Nigel. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well. Nice to see you again.
And nice to see you. I'll just hide that while we chat. Otherwise, we're a bit small. So yeah, you're going to be doing your second IFR webinar. So what will you be covering tonight?
So the thought tonight was how to get the most out of your IMC rating. It's a rating that a lot of people get, but then when they've got it, they're not entirely sure what you're supposed to do with it, what you're meant to do with it. And so you hear a lot of misinformation around. So I thought what we might do tonight is just spend an hour or so just looking at exactly how you can use it and perhaps to explore some of the common pitfalls and how to avoid them.
Brill. Good. Well, I will hide in the background and share your screen in a second. If you have any comments, guys and girls that are watching, stick them in the comments and I'll flash them up as we go along and Nigel can answer them. So there we go. Nigel, take it away.
Thank you very much. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to how to really use an IMC rating. Before we start, a little bit about me and what we're going to talk about. So I'll introduce myself properly in a moment. What I wanted to do is to start with perhaps a bit of a reminder about what the rating is going to allow you to do, and perhaps more importantly, some of the common misconceptions that are around it, trying to unpick a few of those. We're then going to talk a little bit about filing IFR flight plans, which seems to be something which causes a lot of confusion. So we'll talk a little bit about what you do get out of filing an IFR flight plan, and perhaps more importantly, what you don't. Inevitably, any conversation about IFR flight means weather. So since in my experience, at least, people rarely actually learn as much perhaps about the practicalities of understanding weather when they're doing their IMC rating as they might. So a little bit of a refresher on how to be your own Simon and be a proper weather forecaster with the tools that are available on the internet. Then wrapping up, we'll talk a little bit about the ATC services that are there to support IFR flights and how they work. We'll talk a little bit about the process of arriving and approaching into your destination. And then perhaps the hottest topic of all, what personal minima you should perhaps operate to. Is it okay to blast off into dense fog and still hope you're going to survive the flight intact? So that's a little bit about tonight. Firstly, a little bit about me. So why should you be listening to me? What is it that I have to offer? I'm not an instructor. I have been, but I'm not now. Actually, during the day, I'm a lawyer, and I spend most of my time working for different financial regulators, busting financial crime committed either by organized criminal gangs and or occasionally by banks. And occasionally there's relatively little difference between those two groups. But over the course of the years, working both in the US and in the UK, I have gradually become quite an accomplished pilot, I suppose, to the extent I now fly on an ATPL. Clocked up thousands of hours on twins, jets, singles, a lot of it IFR. And the thing that really turns me on is long distance IFR touring. And the picture you can see on your screen now is of the glaciers of Greenland near Narsarsuaq from one of a very large number of transatlantic crossings that I've done. So for me, a full IR is what I fly off, but it's easy to forget the IMC rating. And in fact, I'm very, very keen to promote more people having instrument qualification. So tonight is all about how to get the most out of that IMC qualification. The aircraft that I spend most of my time flying around in is this one, November 101 Delta Whiskey. It's a PA-32 Lance. The reason for showing you this picture, even though it is a lovely picture taken by a friend of mine a few years ago, is that I want to demonstrate that the aircraft that I'm flying in, and therefore a lot of the comments that I'm making today, is not de-iced. This is just like any other PA-28 or Cessna that you would fly, in that it's not turbocharged. I don't have the option of climbing up to 25,000 feet and being above the weather. It's not pressurized. It doesn't have de-icing boots on it or even a hot prop. This is a fairly standard sort of aircraft that's accessible to any PPL. And so when we talk about weather and flight planning, a lot of the considerations are going to be taken from the perspective of that kind of aircraft. And I suspect for most of us, the kind of aircraft that we find ourselves flying as well, this may be a little bit faster than the average, but basically from a systems point of view, it's exactly what you're likely to be flying into. So my comments are going to be aimed at you if this is the kind of aircraft you're flying. If you're flying around in a citation, then some of the comments I'm going to make are rather less relevant. So, quick refresher then about what the license allows, because even now there is still some form of confusion. I'm going to call the license the IMC rating throughout this, although, as you'll be aware, if we're talking EASA, it's an instrument rating brackets restricted, or IRR. If we're talking CAA, it's an IMC rating. I guess to the extent that many of us have now got CAA licenses, we should be talking about the IMC rating going forward. So when I talk about the IMC rating this afternoon, it's going to be only because I want to avoid confusion. If you have an IRR, everything I'm going to say is exactly the same for you. So in no particular order, perhaps the starting point for why you would even have an IMC rating in the first instance is that you probably want to fly outside of sight of the surface. There are days, particularly flying as we all do in the UK, when the weather just isn't that good. It may not be a particularly low cloud base, but you're going to get bumped around horribly under the clouds. And for the sake of being able to climb up through them, you can be in beautiful, clear blue skies, and it's just nicer and more convenient. And that ability to have the option to fly legally outside the sight of surface is a real winner. Speaking for someone who's flown numerous passengers around the place, I find that flying above the cloud is a passenger pleaser too. Very few passengers enjoy the bumps and turbulence that tends to associate with being flown around low level. And just the ability to go up that 1,000 feet or so and put yourself above cloud just sets everybody at their ease. And I don't know about you, but certainly when I was learning to fly, I visualized airline pilot kind of flying. And for me, it was that ability to be disconnected from the ground and above a solid layer of cloud that felt like proper flying. The same way that other people think that aerobatics is proper flying. We're all right, but this is the bit that turns me on. So flying out of sight of service is really important. And without the IMC rating, there are big restrictions around your ability to do that. And in particular, if you are going to fly above a completely solid covered cloud layer, the IMC rating is your starting point on that journey. The other thing it allows you to do is it allows you to fly under instrument flight rules, IFR, in certain grades of controlled airspace, essentially classes D, E, and F. I've included G here. G isn't obviously controlled airspace. Anybody can potentially fly under IFR, not necessarily in IMC, but anybody can declare themselves IFR in Class G if they wish. But the real thing about Class D in particular, and I'm thinking, I guess, around the kind of flight into zones around places like Doncaster and Luton and Bristol and others, is that to get into that airspace, occasionally you're going to need to be able to accept vectors, or you're going to need to be able to be put into cloud. And having that IMC rating gives you the ability to do that. You can accept that IFR transit of their airspace, or you can accept to join in under IFR into that airspace, and the IMC rating is your ticket to that. There was a time, older pilots will remember, if you were flying around in the 1980s and 90s, we didn't have the letters classifying airspace. In those days, we had special rules airspace and control zones, which in some instances you needed a full instrument rating to get into under IFR. The IMC rating in the move towards Class D, E, F, G airspace has really allowed us as private pilots with an IMC rating to extend the scope of conditions under which we can fly, and to fly into much bigger airports without needing to hold a full instrument rating. Worth saying actually that if you are flying IFR and you do enter controlled airspace, it's Class E, and there is a chunk of it around the place. That Class E airspace does require you to have a clearance if you're flying under IFR. If you're VFR, as we would be, you can just enter and leave Class E airspace without any kind of clearance at all. But Class E, if you're IFR, just a reminder, if you're exercising the privileges of your IMC rating, you do actually need a clearance to enter it. Next up, the license allows landings and takeoffs down to a minimum visibility of 1,500 meters. So this is important because a lot of people, when they're talking about flying on instruments or flying using either an instrument rating or an IMC rating, talk about cloud-based minima. You know, I can only go down to 700 feet or 600 feet or 500 feet or whatever it might be. That's actually not what the license says. The license is all about visibility. So long as you have 1,500 meters visibility, then in principle, you're good to make an approach. There's an interesting history behind this. Any of you who've done the IMC rating ground exams recently will have realized that the CAA has somewhat failed to keep up with time. When the IMC rating first came out, the minimum visibility in which you were required to fly was 1 nautical mile. So you could make landings and takeoffs in 1 nautical mile. Then when they discovered the metric system, it came down to 1,800 meters. And then in order to try and make the privileges of the IMC rating consistent with special VFR clearances, the number came back down to 1,500 meters. So though we're used to the CAA being told or being talked about in terms of how they're increasingly restricting our flying, at least in terms of the privileges of the IMC rating, that minimum visibility in which you can take off and land has actually gone in one direction, and it's to become more permissive. 1,500 meters is the number now. But there are a few restrictions, and I think possibly the most well-known one is that the IMC rating magically stops working when you get outside the UK FIR. So although many are tempted, and I'm sure some people do, that pop across to Latuke, your IMC rating turns into a pumpkin when you hit the UK FIR boundary, so no shooting instrument approaches into Latuke under IFR, and likewise no popping across to Ireland and shooting approaches into Waterford under IFR. Interestingly, irrespective of the weather conditions, flight in most of the rest of the world is not like the UK, and it turns out that to fly under an IFR clearance in France, for example, even if the weather conditions are crystal blue VFR flying conditions, you cannot accept an IFR clearance unless you have a full ICAO instrument rating. So hopefully a source of some confusion there we can get rid of immediately. Your IMC rating in no way at all works outside the UK, and it's only the case that you can fly instrument approaches outside the UK strictly as a VFR flight, unless one of you on board has instrument rating in a position to take control of the flight. So that UK restriction I think is well known but often flouted, and it is important to understand your limitations there. Secondly, and I'll emphasize it, and we will come back to this a little later, this concept that you are somehow restricted to no more than, say, 500 feet on an ILS approach and no more than 600 feet on a VOR approach is often trotted out, but that doesn't turn out to be a limitation of the license. And we'll explore this business of cloud base and its relevance to the IMC rating a little bit later on. The other thing I'd like to start by busting as well, and you mentioned it in the trailer as well, Johnny, is this question of the get out of jail free card. People didn't just come up with this randomly. Our very own CAA, when they were first promoting the IMC rating, and it's still present even on their website today, says something like the IMC rating is not planned or not intended as a rating to allow you to plan flight into instrument meteorological conditions. It's intended to serve as a way of getting yourself out of trouble in the event that you inadvertently get into IMC conditions. I have to say that really is bollocks. By very definition, instrument skills are like any other piloting skill. I've used the aerobatics example as a contrast. If you don't practice aerobatics, you get really bad at it. Aerobatics is not a qualification that you use from time to time when you feel like it. It's something you practice and you get good at. Instrument flying is exactly the same. If you once got a rating and then 2 years later you decide it might be a good idea to shoot an instrument approach in real cloud, you're likely to get bitten. So the idea that the IMC rating is in some way a rating that you pass and then you thank your lucky stars you've never had to fly a real approach, and then one day you think maybe it'll get you out of trouble is an idea to park. It isn't a get out of jail free card. It's a real license, and it isn't really valid unless you use it. So we're going to talk a little bit later on about how frequently do you think you need to be using it to be anything like current, and what sort of minimum should you fly to if you're anything other than sparkly current. So let's just quickly visit what the UK AIP has to say about aerodrome operating minima, because this is the bit which frequently confuses people about what cloud base they're allowed to fly in and what the minimum altitude is that they're allowed to come down on an approach. So there's a section of the UK AIP called the aerodrome operating minima, and I've literally just done a screenshot of it and pasted it on here. And you can see immediately where the confusion comes from. I'll read the first section. Pilots with a valid IMC rating are recommended to add 200 feet to the minimum applicable decision height with an absolute minimum of 500 feet for a precision approach and 600 feet for a non-precision approach. Quick reminder there, a precision approach is something like an ILS where you've got glide slope guidance as well as guidance left and right of the center line. A non-precision approach might be something like an NDB DME approach or VOR approach, where you've got guidance left and right of the center line, but you don't have positive guidance in terms of the glide slope. So you could say, well, if you're flying down an ILS approach where the minimum or the decision height is 200 feet, that you can add a couple of hundred feet to that and then round it up to 500 feet, and that's as low as you can go. In other words, if you're flying down the approach, you get to 500 feet, you can't see the runway, you have to go around. That's not the case. This is a recommendation. It's not a part of your licensing condition. The licensing condition, once again, is that in order to make your approach, you need to have 1,500 meters visibility. And this is important because, particularly when you are flying in poor visibility, it's not often the case that you burst out of cloud and suddenly you're in a gin clear day beneath the cloud at 500 feet or 600 feet. More often than not, the cloud gradually thins and thins and thins to a point where you can just about see the runway approach lights through it. And this is important because it means that actually, if you're relying on 500 feet as your minimum, your descent or decision height rather, there will be occasions when actually, for want of descending another 50 feet, you will be able to see the runway and you'll still be perfectly legal to land because the visibility will be above 1,500 meters. So the 500 feet and the 600 feet, key point here, these are advisory. They're recommended. They're recommended for a reason, which is if you're not doing approaches often, you probably don't want to be flying lower than these kind of levels. But they are not the law. They are a recommendation to guide you. And if you are an IMC rated pilot who routinely flies under IFR in IMC, there's absolutely no reason at all why from a altitude point of view, you shouldn't be coming down to the sort of levels associated with instrument rating. The only absolute minimum you have to obey is the 1,500 meter visibility limit. It's also worth saying, once again, that almost to contradict itself, the CAA also talks about pilots not in current practice. So this would be your guy who thinks that the IMC rating is perhaps a get out of jail free card. So a pilot not in current practice should try to avoid having to make an instrument approach. I think we'd all agree with that. So if you really are someone who once got an IMC rating and hasn't really practiced or done any approaches under instrument conditions, either simulated with foggles or in real life, you probably fall under this piece of guidance here where you shouldn't be trying to make approaches in poor weather conditions. And it's perfectly respectable, and you see plenty of people doing this, where they will effectively use the IMC rating as a way of breaking up through cloud to get to clearer air above. And likewise, if they know that the cloud base is relatively high, they'll break through cloud to make then a normal visual arrival. And that's a perfectly decent way of using the rating. That's why a lot of people do it. But just bear in mind there are pitfalls, again, with descending through cloud in the hope that you're going to break visual without hitting anything. So I've produced this page and I've labeled it slightly because the most common misconception in my experience of people's understanding of what they can and cannot do with an IMC rating is all about these minimum for approach. They are well worthwhile taking on board, they're well worthwhile understanding, but they are not the law, they are just a guideline. So we've said that you are allowed to fly in accordance with instrument flight rules in IMC with your IMC rating. But when you ask people, so what are the instrument flight rules, then people are often a bit confused because it's something that they vaguely did when they did their PPL air law, but they're not quite sure what they are in retrospect. We're all really used to learning that tedious table of distances from clouds and in-flight visibility for learning the VFR rules, but instrument flight rules often elude people. The good news is that there really are only two instrument flight rules. And the first is to do with the minimum level you should be flying. And so when you're cruising in IFR conditions, you're expected to be 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle within 5 nautical miles of your aircraft. If you check out various sources for these rules, you'll see that Sarah conveniently quotes it as 8 kilometers. And you'll see that the Americans have their own definition. But the essence of it is you need to be 1,000 feet above obstacles on your route. And if you're flying over particularly mountainous territory, then that gets increased to 2,000 feet above the obstacle. So if you're planning a route, you draw a line on a map, you look at the obstacles around that route, and to be IFR, your cruising level needs to obey this minimum level. And it is a minimum level. You're not supposed to plan a cruise below it. There is a little bit of an exception, which again you'll find if you look at the rule book, which is that if you're below 3,000 feet, and if you're clear of cloud and in sight of the surface, and you've got at least 800 meters visibility in flight, then you don't actually need to obey these rules. But you'll appreciate that really kind of covers you for the immediate departure phase of your flight, and perhaps some element of an arrival, although 800 meters viz, as you'll appreciate, is below the minimum for your takeoff and landing. So in principle, the first of the instrument flight rules is about minimum level. And the second is about what level you're supposed to cruise at. So it's all about levels, really. If you're above 3,000 feet, then you are supposed to select either an altitude or flight level, depending on where the transition layer is, which is a whole number of thousands of feet. So flight level 30, 40, 50, 60, or 4,000 feet, 5,000 feet, 6,000 feet. But it's meant to be chosen in accordance with a semicircular rule. And so what we mean by that, just as a refresher, is if you're flying on a track rather than heading, which is on the left-hand side of the compass, then you're meant to be on an even 1,000 feet or flight level. And if you're on the right-hand side, as it were, of the tracks, then you're meant to be on an odd flight level, so 30, 50, 70. Again, it's interesting, if any of you have recently done the IMC rating tests, the written tests, many of them still think that the quadrantal rule is in place. In fact, if you've got older textbooks, the quadrantal rule still seems to apply. But just for the avoidance of any doubt at all, we're all semicircular now. The quadrantal rule has gone the way of the Brontosaurus. And if you're above 3,000 feet, you're expected to choose either an altitude or a flight level which complies with the semicircular rule. So if you say you're IFR, even if you're outside controlled airspace, this is what is expected of you. And an interesting little feature I've not included here is that recent changes to the terminology around transponder usage is whether when we're flying VFR, we're accustomed to squawking 7,000. If you're outside controlled airspace and you're flying IFR, in other words, you're complying with these two rules here, you're expected to squawk 2,000. Many people don't appreciate that. So if you're IFR, squawk 2,000. It's a good clue for controllers in the airspace you're flying near that you're complying with instrument flight rules, rather than most of the aircraft they'll see around flying 7,000. So if you're told by a controller, as you will be these days, squawk conspicuity, it's your choice whether you're squawking 7,000 or 2,000, depending on the flight rules that you're complying with. But if you're going to squawk 2,000, you need to be complying with these rules, and that includes your minimum level and the appropriate cruising level. Want to move on to, having got rid of those basics, the concept of a flight plan, because again, this is another source of confusion. What's different about the flight plan I file if I'm going to go IFR than if I've previously been filing flight plans to go VFR? And the answer is that because this is the UK and because we do things differently from almost everywhere else in the world, the answer is actually not as straightforward as first meets the eye. So I've handily reproduced on the right-hand side of the sheet the International Flight Plan Form, the ICAO Flight Plan Form, with which hopefully many of you are familiar. And I've circled three areas which we're going to talk about tonight. First of them, you can see shaded in the sort of highlighter pen, is the addressees section. The bit that, if those of us that remember filling in these things manually, the bit you don't touch because you hand it to a friendly person over the other side of the desk and they fill the addressees in for you. We'll come back to that. The second is the flight rules box, which I've circled in red. This is where normally we put V if we're VFR. If we're IFR, we put I. Just for completeness, there are also a couple of other options. You can file Z in there. This is a flight which starts off VFR, but which is going to become IFR at some point along its route. And Y, which is a flight plan where the flight is going to start IFR but become VFR at some later point, such as a flight which is arriving into a VFR-only airfield. But for most purposes, we're talking about the difference between V and I on a flight plan. So if we just turn to a conventional VFR flight for a moment, normally if we file a flight, we're going to the 2K, or we're even flying somewhere in the UK and we just feel like to practice, or we're using Sky Demon and we want to file our flight plan, we file it VFR and we complete the bit which starts from message type, the bit in the middle of the screen here. And we're pretty much oblivious to what gets filed in the yellow highlighted section. And what goes into there might surprise people because it's actually less than you might think. There are basically 3 sets of addressees that receive a VFR flight plan. The first is the air traffic control at the aerodrome that you're leaving. And the second is the air traffic control at the aerodrome you're proposing to fly to. And the third is the people in the FIR, if you will, London Information or Scottish Information. It's for this reason that, for example, if you phone up from an uncontrolled field, or whether you call London Information from an uncontrolled field, they can activate your flight plan because they've been copied on it. They can see it. Many people are surprised because VFR flight plans don't naturally go to any intermediate place. So if you're flying from, I don't know, Cambridge to Gloucester, you might imagine that Birmingham or Brize Norton or someone of that sort might see your flight plan too, but they don't. VFR plans go to very restricted addressees, where you come from, where you're going to, and the FIR. And that's pretty much it. So you can imagine that most of those people don't really care whether you're IFR or VFR. They received a VFR flight plan, but they're perfectly happy that if the weather has gone downhill by the time you arrive, you may well want an instrument approach. The fact it has a V on your flight plan is a matter of some indifference to them. And also, if you're spending most of your time flying outside controlled airspace, they don't kind of know or care whether you're going in and out of clouds and obeying the instrument flight rules or not. And this is important because for many of us, if we're filing an IFR flight plan, we're not, because we are only equipped with IMC rating, going to be going into the airways or flying into Class A airspace like the TMA. We're going to fly a route pretty much like the route we would have flown if we were VFR. We're just signaling that we're IFR because either we're recognizing that the weather is poor and therefore VFR doesn't seem credible, or we wish to somehow communicate to our destination that we are an IFR flight. And this is interesting because if we are outside controlled airspace and if we are going IFR, then the addressees on the flight plan don't change. So if you file an IFR flight plan by putting an I in there, but your routing details are essentially the same as they always were, you're going from Cambridge, you're routing via, say, the Daventry VOR, and you're then going to Gloucester, nobody else is going to receive that flight plan. So just because you then call up Brize Norton and ask for some form of traffic service, they're not going to know about you. They're still going to require the full 9 yards from you because your flight plan hasn't gone to them. And this confuses a lot of people because they somehow assume that if they file an IFR flight plan, then suddenly the whole world en route knows about you, and they just don't. Practically, it's just a different letter on exactly the same flight plan they would have seen before. The third flight plan I'll call an Airways IFR flight plan, but there isn't really a proper name for it, is an IFR flight plan where the routing actually deliberately takes us into controlled airspace. So we climb into the London TMA and we route via Airways to our destination. And this kind of flight plan, it still has an I in the flight rules box, but the difference is the addressees. Instead of going to your instead of going to just the place you went, place you came from, the place you're going to, and the FIR, in addition to all of those, this also goes to Eurocontrol in Brussels, where a huge computer works out whether your routing is possible, because there are a whole load of rules about who can use which airways at which times, at which levels, for which purposes. And also they work out things like slots to figure out whether the particular airway is congested at a particular point in time, in order to try and figure out how to flow the flights. And most of us will have been on a holiday jet at some point that got stuck somewhere because it encountered a slot. All of these things are worked out based on a very restricted set of routes that IFR flights in controlled airspace can follow. So in fact, it's not the putting of the I on the flight plan which makes you, shall we call it, a proper IFR flight. It's the fact that your flight plan gets addressed to the various Eurocontrol addresses, and from there gets distributed automatically to all of the en route IFR controllers who are likely to handle the flight, so that you then get seamless end-to-end service, the sort of thing we always dream about but never really get as VFR pilots in the UK. So I notice a question actually from Chris Boyle. Are alternates included? Yes, absolutely, I should say. If you include a alternate, then again, ordinarily they will be copied into your flight plan as well, whether you're VFR or IFR. So I guess the point I'm making is that you might imagine that putting I in your flight plan makes a huge difference, but it just doesn't. Unless you are deliberately filing an Airways IFR flight plan, which is not a real term, but I'm using it just to kind of try and draw a distinction here. In other words, a flight plan which is going to be sent to Eurocontrol, which is going to cause your aircraft to fly inside controlled airspace from its departure to its destination, then essentially your flight plan is doing no more than a normal VFR flight plan, and you're still going to do all of the hard work that you always do, calling and giving people your standard check-in and asking for a service and hoping that they'll provide it to you. So you feel like you should get special treatment, but you just don't. And that is unfortunate. It's the combination of the route you file, the level you file it at, and more particularly the addressees on the flight plan that determine how you're treated. So this is interesting because for many of you, and I guess there will be many of you who are using tools like SkyDemon, SkyDemon files flight plans for you and it automatically addresses in the way that I've described, but critically it only files VFR flight plans. So in other words, SkyDemon is no good for filing the kind of Airways IFR flights because it doesn't know about the routings and the addressings to use for Eurocontrol. So one of the reasons you often hear people say, well, SkyDemon's great, but if you're going IFR, SkyDemon's not so great. Actually, that's not really true. SkyDemon is brilliant. I'm a big fan. It's also brilliant if you're filing the kind of IFR flight plans that an IMC rating holder might fly, because in essence, even though it's going to file a plan with a V in the flight rules box, practically it's still sending it to the right people. If you want a similar tool which is going to file both VFR plans but will also handle IR style IFR Airways plans, for that you need a tool like 4Flight or Garmin Pilot or some of the others that are on the market. But SkyDemon will get you a very, very long way, and certainly as an IMC rating holder wishing to fly around under IFR, the fact that your flight plan will be filed with a V in the box makes effectively no difference at all to who's going to receive it and what kind of service you get. And I've given an example just at the bottom here of what an Airways routing might look like. This is a flight, as you can possibly see, from Cambridge, EGSC, to Jersey, EGJJ. We are joining controlled airspace en route to Barkway, VOR, then to a reporting point called Silver, which is over by Westcott, down airway Q41 to Ortac, and then from Ortac straight into Jersey. I was just looking here, another question actually from Mark. Are you allowed to fly Airways with just 4Flight, or do you need an approved aircraft with GPS, etc. on board? The boring answer to your question is that it kind of depends. You are required to comply with the equipment levels that are specified in the air navigation order for IFR flight. So, for example, if you have an aircraft which essentially has 1 altimeter, 1 radio, and not very much else, but you have a copy of 4Flight on your lap, that wouldn't be an approved configuration for IFR flight. But those rules are complex, and not for nothing is that a bit of a tedious read. But unfortunately, the only good answer to give you, Mark, is you need to take a look at that schedule, and that will give you a minimum equipment list, as it were, for IFR flight. And David asks, is there actually a benefit for an IRR holder to file I? Strictly speaking, I think probably not. I guess you could stretch a point. I'm not an air traffic controller, so I don't know what they would say. But, I suppose if the destination knows you filed I, they probably expect you to come in on an instrument approach. But to be honest with you, when you make your initial call, if you tell them you're IFR and you're looking for an instrument approach, then all of that added value can be accomplished in one simple radio call. So I'm never encouraging people to file a flight plan that doesn't correctly reflect the flight rules they're following. But between us, the honest added value to putting an I in the box, if it's a straightforward flight plan that's not going to Eurocontrol, pretty limited. So that concludes my comments on flight plans, because there's, as you can imagine, a bit of a chunk to get through on weather. Lovely photo here of a ramp in the US with a bit of a downpour that you really wouldn't want to go flying through. So when we're talking about IFR weather, clearly we get the rating because presumably we think we're going to be flying through cloud at some point, and we think we want to be above it, in it. We want to be able to play with it properly. But my experience is that people being taught the IMC rating often don't really get taught anything extra about the weather, and they're really relying on their MET course they did for their PPL, which in some cases may be a few years old. So what I wanted to do was, in the course of the next 4 or 5 slides, just to give a few hints and tips about how I assess weather for an IFR flight. I'm assessing them often for an airways flight, but not always, and the same principles apply. So what we're really interested in frontal situation. You know, flying through fronts is where we see most of our weather in Europe. So there's a good starting point. Knowing whether there is a front between you and your destination is an interesting starting point. So we're looking at that general frontal situation. Where are they? What kind of fronts are they? Are they small fronts, large fronts? And are they moving? And if so, where to? We're interested in not only fronts themselves, but also their close cousins, troughs, which we'll talk about in a moment. And we're interested in winds. It's all very well doing a brilliant IFR flight if you find yourself coming down an ILS with a 40-knot crosswind. So we're interested not only in IFR-y stuff, but all the basics still count. Just because you have an IMC rating doesn't mean that you're immune to crosswinds on landing. So we're trying to assess all of this. We're trying to understand also the cloud bases and types. Cloud base, having said that it's not mandatory, clearly if the cloud base is 150 feet, the chances of you making a landing are pretty slim whilst complying with the limitations of your license. Likewise, we're interested in what type of cloud it is. Many of you who've got IMC ratings will know that flying through stratus cloud can actually be quite relaxing. You'd almost know you almost wouldn't know you were in the cloud. Stratus clouds tend to be associated with drizzle rather than heavy rain. They tend to be associated with stable air masses. So actually, flying in and around a few layers of stratus can be a very relaxing, pleasant experience. Flying through big cumulus clouds, and the taller they get, the worse they are, is absolutely the opposite. So it's not enough to know that there is cloud at 2,000 feet or cloud at 1,500 feet. We need to know what kind of cloud it is and whether we're likely to enjoy the ride that goes through it. And as we know, certain kinds of clouds, and it tends to be the cumuliform clouds, are associated with other less desirable things, particularly when they get very tall, like hail, thunder, lightning, and very, very intense updrafts and downdrafts. So it's not enough to know where there's going to be cloud and where there's not going to be cloud. We want to know a little bit about it. We also want to be able to predict visibility a little bit. It's not enough, again, to know that the cloud base is only around 2,000 feet if there's a danger of fog. And if there is going to be precipitation of some sort, what is it going to be? Is it going to be light drizzle, which we might love, or is it going to be golf ball-sized hailstones? So understanding that from the weather is important. And finally, I mentioned from the outset, my aircraft's not de-iced, so it's very important to me to know where the freezing layer is. If the freezing layer, in other words, the level where I'm going to fly through the 0 degree outside air temperature line, if that's 2,000 feet, then I might think very hard about cruising at 3,000 or 4,000 feet in cloud because I'm going to pick up ice. So all of these things I'm interested in. I want to talk briefly about how I go about assessing what I'm likely to be up against. So a lot of people start with the TAFs and actuals, and it's very tempting because when we first do our pilot training, we are always wedded to looking at TAFs and actuals to see whether we can do our VFR flight or not. And often when you're looking at particularly cross-country flying, TAFs and actuals can be very misleading because the TAFs and actuals on either side of a front can both look wonderful. And what you miss is the bigger picture, that there's a front between you and your destination. I'm not suggesting that the picture in front of you would be a good day to fly on, but suppose for the sake of argument you were flying from Biggin Hill, but you were flying down to Newquay in Cornwall. Both of those actuals right now look pretty good. And what you miss out on is this whopping great occluded front that sits between. So I've always found that top-down is the way to go with weather. We're looking really to assess what's the general position. This is, as I hastily put my slides together this morning for this show, this is actually tomorrow's synoptic chart, downloaded for free from the Met Office site, but many weather sites will allow you to see this for free. And immediately what we can see is that the predominant feature for tomorrow is actually not just one occluded front, but another occluded front right behind it. And in fact, a very deep, low swirl there just off the northwest coast of Ireland. And we can see by the proximity of the isobars together that there's going to be very, very strong winds. A reminder that isobars follow anti-clockwise around a low in the northern hemisphere. So if you don't remember that in the spur of the moment, where the blobs are on the fronts tells you the direction the wind's pointing. So you can see that the arrows and the arches for the occluded fronts are both pointing towards the east-ish. That's telling us that the wind is flowing west to east, anti-clockwise around that low area, just as a prompt. We can also see the QNH 1004 as on the isobar that's running through London. And we can see how densely packed they are, so we can see quite how strong that wind is going to be. So before we even start, we know we've got quite severe frontal activity. So what kind of activity would we expect before we look in detail? My Mickey Mouse guide, and it is a Mickey Mouse guide, Simon would be shocked at this, but it does kind of work. Occluded fronts are horrible. Think big thunderstorms. Very unusual to see occluded fronts without fairly severe uplift. Which means tall cumulus clouds and at the very least some decent sized hail, big bumps, lots of turbulence, icing above the freezing layer, and probably thunderstorms. And here we've got a double whammy of them, two occluded fronts hot on the heels of one another, bound to be bad news. And when you consider where will the bad news be, you can typically say, well, it's kind of a balloon shape around the front. So there's a bit of it in front of the front, there's a bit of it behind the front. And I'll show you a little bit more about what I mean there as we go on to look at a couple more pictures. Cold fronts are next down in my least popular league. Cold fronts, again, tend to be associated, in my experience, with rather more unstable air. It's not a meteorological fact. It's just my observation over years of flying through these things that cold fronts tend to be, again, somewhat more aggressive. They tend to be more associated with larger, more cumulus-like cloud buildups, and associated with the rather heavier weather and the greater bumpiness than you would expect to see elsewhere. And once again, around a cold front, you would expect to see a sort of virtual balloon. I don't know, looking at the scale of this, perhaps if you take the height of the peak of one of those triangles, maybe project that two triangles forward and a couple of triangles back, that would be the sort of width of the front in terms of the particular bad weather around it. Then the last of the fronts, and you have to look all the way across towards New Brunswick and that kind of area, is a warm front. My experience of warm fronts is they're actually quite fun. They tend to be associated longer term with poorer visibility. They tend to be associated with stratus cloud and with drizzly weather. But from the point of view of passenger comfort flying through them, flying through a warm front is rarely a terrible experience. And once again, I'm generalizing horribly. You need to be aware of the freezing level, but providing icing is not a consideration, warm fronts are by all accounts the least intimidating of the fronts. Quick word about troughs. Troughs, and you can see examples of these. These are the black lines that you may be able to see. There's one up south of the Baltics. There's one just on the edge of the Alps in the south of France. These are sort of failed fronts, and again, this is not a scientific definition. They're effectively folds in the weather, and they tend to, in my experience, again, be traps for cloud. So you can almost think of them as being places where clouds and showers are likely to congregate. So not as bad as fronts, but a big trough can be every bit as scary as a front. So you would associate precipitation and cloud with those troughs. So we've learned a lot about fronts and troughs, a lot about wind strength and direction, and we've learned a lot about visibility just by looking at the synoptic. So we already know that it's probably not the greatest idea to plan fly out to Cardiff midday tomorrow, because you'll be right in the middle of an occluded front. But you have to do a lot of work to get meaning out of this. And once I've done this, I tend to use a tool called windy.com, which many of you will be familiar with. This is exactly the same time as seen on Windy. So if I now confuse you all by flicking quickly back and forwards, look at where those fronts are crossing the west coast of Wales into Northern Ireland, and look at exactly this. You can almost see the front. This is the so-called rain and thunder view, and I've included here the sort of tab on the side of the windy thing, which actually shows you what it looks like to select it. This is the rain and thunder tab. It's my starting point for any windy analysis. And you'll see immediately those two occluded fronts I promised you. The blueness here is the amount of precipitation. So the more intense, the turquoisey areas and even the very dark green areas around Newry here are where the precipitation is at its most intense. And you'll even see here that around the second of the occluded fronts, we are seeing a projection of lightning, so thunderstorms and everything that goes with it. You'll tend to find with tools like Windy that it's very, very difficult anyway for even trained meteorologists to predict exactly where a thunderstorm is going to pop up. So what you'll tend to see is that everywhere where it's possible, you're going to see lightning strikes. In reality, it's unlikely that everywhere you see a lightning strike is actually going to see a thunderstorm tomorrow. But for planning purposes, if you didn't bother looking at the synoptic beforehand and hadn't heard me say that occluded fronts are kind of a byword for thunderstorms, this is a good visual prompt that flying towards Dublin tomorrow might be a bit fraught. What's also interesting, though, is the grey area. The vast majority of this tells you that actually in those grey areas there is no precipitation expected at the time concerned. And although precipitation and cloud are two different things, you can get cloud without precipitation falling out of it. This screen is a good starting point in your exploration of Windy because it actually tells you where the more dense cloud is likely to be. And we kind of knew that already because we'd looked at the synoptic chart. Once I've done that, which has really done little more than confirm what I feared when I looked at the synoptic, the next place I go to on Windy is a cloud base view. And again, it's the little helicopter icon you can see here that brings up that view. Essentially, the grey areas mean no clouds predicted, at least none at the level that we're going to be interested in. The green tint refers to cloud bases that are typically in a range of about 3,500 to 5,000 or more feet. So perfectly flyable, even VFR typically. The blue, the sort of thing that we can see just to the west of Birmingham, is typically cloud bases around the 1,500 to 3,500 mark. So blue covers a multitude of sins. Blue's interesting because in its worst extent, blue could make VFR flight pretty much impossible. Higher up, you might still have the option of being VFR if that's what you wanted to do. It's when you get to the reds and the purples that you can see just to the south of Dublin here, which is where essentially we're talking about IFR flight only because the cloud bases are coming down at and well below the 1,000-foot mark. Notice this tells us nothing about visibility. This is just about predicted cloud. And the other final nuance, which is important here, is if we take a look at Hull and the immediate environment there, Hull's got very sort of bright green around it. So this is the 3,500 to 5,000 odd foot cloud base. If you look out into the North Sea, you'll see the same green tint, but rather more translucent. This is Windy's attempt to say what's the cloud cover. The kind of solid green tells you we're likely to be looking at an overcast or broken at that kind of cloud base level. This tells us it's more likely to be few or scattered. So once again, not so much a cloud ceiling, just the height of the lowest clouds. And surprise, surprise, you can almost pick out where the front is. The front is really marked by these relatively low blue areas, with the sort of red areas showing the points of the predicted most severe precipitation. So really interesting because it kind of double confirms what we thought we knew already about the front. So not only have we got lightning, not only have we got heavy precipitation, we've also got low ceilings in that area as well. So IMC rating or not, probably not an area that you would be wanting to explore. And I think if I saw that, I was planning to go to Belfast, even with an IR, I would be staying on the ground. And that takes us finally to the visibility view. So the visibility view is similar sort of color scheme. Green is sort of goodish, blue not so good, red really quite bad, and purple quite catastrophic. So what we're looking at here is the visibility. And again, I hesitate to use generalizations, but green and blue is sort of still vaguely VFRable from a viz point of view. The red is kind of taking you into the territory where you're starting to push on that 1500 meter limit. And some of the purples are taking you below the 1500 meter visibility limit. So no matter what the cloud base, and we've already talked about that, you could find that you're up against the actual legal limitation, the 1500 meter limitation, if you're proposing to fly into those kinds of places. Right now, on the other hand, you could be flying quite happily into sort of the T side area, because the visibility, whilst it's not perfect, is going to be well above the 1500 meter limit, according to the model. And I should say, because Simon will be screaming at the screen if you were watching now, that these are models. They can be wrong, and the further you go out into the future, the more likely they are to be wrong. So I find that one of the useful things about Windy is that 10 days ahead of a flight, I can start to get a general picture, and then I can slide the slider, and each day as I get closer to my intended departure, I can look and see how the model's developing. And you can even see the same output I've just been showing you, but through 3 or 4 different models. So you can get a sense of how much the models are in agreement, which normally they are, it has to be said, or whether there's a risk that the model will are diverging, which means that the weather is sufficiently complex that the mathematical models are all confused. So I urge you to play with Windy. It's a great tool. It doesn't provide instant foresight, but it does provide a really good sense of what IFR weather might be like. For IFR pilots, we're supposed to be able to fly in cloud, but there is cloud and cloud. And this gives you a pretty good idea as to whether the starting point is good. But I realize what it hasn't done is to tell us about the types of cloud and potentially how high they go. And you can achieve a lot of that on Windy, but I thought in interests of broadening your armory, I'm going to introduce Gramet for those of you that are unfamiliar. So Gramet stands for an Italian abbreviation, which I'm not going to do justice to, but you can think of it as being a vertical section through your flight. Those of you who use either ForeFlight or perhaps more importantly SkyDemon will be familiar with the virtual radar display that you get at the bottom, which is like a vertical section through your flight. Think of this as a kind of a posh version of that, modeling the weather. So what you do, if you go to autorouter.aero, it's totally free to use. You don't even need to register on the site. You get a screen that looks a little bit like this, and I've typed my route in. I'm going from Cambridge to Compton VOR, and I'm going to go to Gloucester. I'm going to go at flight level 50. I'm going to go on the 7th, and I'm going to go at 9 Zulu. And I reckon the flight's going to take me about an hour. I can alternatively put my cruise speed in. And I've chosen the GFS model. And I click on request. And what do I get back? What I get back is a diagram that looks like this. It's sort of a vertical cross section. EGSC, Cambridge, my departure at the left-hand side. EGBJ, Gloucester on the right-hand side. And the magenta line shows this time what flight level 50 looks like. So immediately you're going to see that it's predicting lots of stratus light cloud around the place, particularly at lower levels. You can see this band here of stratus cloud at extremely low level, potentially, what would you say? That's about 1,500 feet. Lots of rain, which is what these dashes are coming out. And at Cambridge, perhaps cumulus cloud. This is what this sort of ice cream cone looks like, starting at around 4,500 feet. So we're going to potentially fly into stratus cloud as we take off and head towards Compton. Unbeknownst, though, we're going to start to fly into the bottom of these extremely tall cumulus clouds that are projected to have bases around the 2,500 foot mark. So you might take off thinking stratus, that's really good, not much turbulence there, and all of a sudden actually you find yourself in cumulus clouds you never saw because the stratus stopped you from seeing them. And at 5,000 feet, 50, you're right in the middle of the bases of these clouds. You're going to get bounced around really quite horribly at 50. And in fact, you're probably not going to break out until you get to about a quarter of the way between Compton and Gloucester, at which point you're going to be in clear of air, stratus clouds beneath you, but it's not over yet, probably in part triggered by the kind of terrain that you can see here at Gloucester. You're starting to see more cumulus clouds around Gloucester. Hopefully you're going to be on your descent at that point. But my diagnosis, this would be a really crappy flight. Your passengers will hate you forever if you do it at 5,000 feet because you're going to be bounced all the way there. It's going to be unpleasant. You're going to have heavy rain on it. The only thing that's positive about it is that the 0 degree line, the point at which freezing starts, is quite high, around, what would you say, 8,000 feet there. So you're not going to turn into an ice cube, but you might well be hit by golf ball sized hail coming out of some of these clouds. And the thing to look at is just how high they go. The tops of some of these clouds are right up around sort of the 28, 29,000 feet mark, where the tops of the clouds are at 30 degrees, minus 40 degrees, this kind of thing. Lots of ice is going to form at the top of these, make it big enough, it's going to fall out the bottom. So you're not only going to see rain here, but conceivably you could be hit by hail as you're going through those clouds. So you can see that this is painting a picture which is enhanced in some ways over what I was showing you in Windy, because it tells you a little bit about the quality of the ride you're going to experience. And actually, it also allows you to level spot. Is there a good level here? Well, you could say, you could avoid a lot of this by being down at around 2,000 feet. You'll go in and out of a little bit of that bottom of that stratus layer. You'll possibly miss some of the stratus layer and you'll be VFR. This could be a day where, if you don't mind being bounced around, because it will still be a bit bouncy underneath those clouds, putting your IMC rating behind you and actually going up low level, 1,500 feet to 2,000 if you really have to do the journey, and not even meddling going IFR, is a better answer. So an important lesson, and one of the reasons that I lucked out in choosing this particular route, is that often the better use for an IMC rating and even an IR is not to use it. And even with my IR, and I say that with all irony, I can't go at 30,000 feet. I can't get above this weather. And on a short route like this, you wouldn't really want to be climbing and then descending. This is just a good day either to go VFR or to stay on the ground and attend a Flyer Club lecture. Just for contrast, I wanted to show you what a better day looks like. So this was a flight of mine from near Bedford to down to Bournemouth. And I was flying in Airways at flight level 100, and you can see it was perfect opportunity. Flight level 100, just about, you can see here, it's obliterated by the purple line, corresponds to the freezing layer, but I'm not flying or predicted to be flying in cloud around the freezing layer. And in fact, I'm going to be above the majority of what you can see is basically a stratus layer the whole way there. The only time I'm going to get bumped around a little bit is as I descend through these rather smaller cumulus clouds on my approach into Bournemouth. And these are cumulus clouds. Yes, they're going to be bumpy. I probably need to reduce speed and manage my descent carefully as I come in. But they are not the kind of cumulus clouds with their tops around 30,000 feet where I'm going to see all those undesirable effects I would have seen before. And critically, they're all below the freezing level. So I'm not going to freeze. I'm going to see some rain in them, and I am going to get bumped around. I'm going to warn my passengers to tighten their seatbelts as we descend. This isn't a bad day to be doing an IFR flight. I happen to have chosen a day where you had to be at 10,000 feet, but there are plenty of these where all of the stratus is down low level. And by being at 4,000 or 5,000 feet, you can be nicely above it. So Grammet is a great tool. It's free. I recommend it to you. Do take a look at it. And as a way of building a picture of what your flight's going to be like, once again, you can play with it many days in advance of your flight, and the forecast just gets better and better and better as you get closer to your day of departure, and it may save you a wasted hotel fee or over-promising your passengers and then delivering them a horrible flight. So that is weather. You could easily cover days on weather, but for the purposes of tonight, that's weather. I wanted to just talk a little bit about ATC and how ATC works. And given my comments on flight plans, it won't come as a surprise to you to know that basically ATC doesn't work any differently for an IFR flight outside controlled airspace as it does for a VFR flight. There are a couple of differences that are worth thinking about, though. So I've imagined this little route from Sywell through Daventry VOR down to Gloucester. It's a flight that you can quickly see you can do at 4,000 feet, which, remembering the semicircular rule, would be a nice altitude to do it at. The Daventry CTA starts at 5,500, so I'm not going to bust controlled airspace. Probably from a good airmanship point of view, I might try and plan to avoid this glider site, although I am above the 3.2 that's listed. But not a bad little IFR route. And if it were a day where there were stratus clouds starting at, say, 1,500 feet and going up to 6,000, I might be prepared for a flight where I'm never going to break clear of cloud, but it's a nice, easy, straightforward flight. So the question is, who do I talk to? And the answer is exactly the same as it would be for your VFR flight. If we were treating this as a VFR flight, chances are that we would ignore Birmingham because they're not a LARS provider and they tend not to want to provide a service outside controlled airspace. That said, these days, with not much commercial traffic around, a lot of people who would never deign to talk to light aircraft outside controlled airspace have suddenly found that they're happy to provide a service. So you could chance your arm, but the correct answer is probably not Birmingham. So where else do I look? Well, Luton's just kind of off the edge here, but same thing applies to them as applies to Birmingham. They're not a notified LARS provider. The LARS provider for this area is Bryce. So Bryce actually have a staggering range, and you can look this up always in the AIP, but it's also provided very helpfully on tools like SkyDemon and ForeFlight. Bryce can actually see you and provide you a service pretty much all the way up to around Northampton, and pretty much all the way to Cheltenham, to Gloucester, that is. So you could pretty much get airborne, and as soon as you've got yourself comfortable and you're in your groove, you can call up Bryce 124275 and you can ask for a service. Question is, what kind of service should you ask for? Basic service might be okay if you're VFR. There have been a number of air proxies where the Airprox board have specifically criticized pilots flying IFR for not getting a traffic service if it was available. So my top tip is VFR or IFR, irrespective of whether you're in IMC or VMC, ask for a traffic service because you cannot be criticized for asking. And if you're going to be at 4-0, radars, like all of these things, the higher you are, the further away you can be seen. Chances are, even at Northampton at 4,000 feet, Bryce will offer you a traffic service. If you're at 1,500 feet, you might get a basic service, and they'll make it into a traffic service as soon as you either get closer or get higher. Telling them in your initial call that you're IFR and either the level you're at, which should be in abeyance to the IFR rules we talked about earlier, and telling them that you're looking for a traffic service should do it. VFR pilots are sometimes actively discouraged from going for the next level of service, a deconfliction service. Deconfliction service is where, even though you're outside controlled airspace, in addition to telling you about other traffic, air traffic control will provide you vectors to remain a long way away from that traffic. And on a busy summer's day, getting a deconfliction service can annoy everybody because the requirement to keep you away from every other traffic, whether it's identified correctly or not, will cause you to be vectored all over the countryside. And in the case of a VFR pilot, it could cause you to be vectored on a heading that could take you into cloud and therefore not in compliance with your license. So IFR flights are the ones that should be using the deconfliction service if they wish. VFR flights should always ask for a traffic service. And as a result, traffic service is what you should get, providing you're high enough and close enough to the unit concerned. Ken England says, I've mentioned airways a number of times. Must you have a full IR to fly in the airways? Most airways, like 99% of them, are Class A. And again, if you recall the privileges of the IMC rating, you can fly IFR but in D, E, and F. So D, E, and F controlled airspace, you can fly IFR with an IMC rating, but Class A, such as the London TMA or most airways, you may not. So airways flying in TMAs, you may not. But looking at the map we've got up in front of us at the moment, the Class D that you can see around Birmingham, you could fly in that. Obviously, you need a clearance to enter Class D airspace, IFR or VFR, but you do need a clearance. Andy Randall asks that he's missed the start. Will there be a way of watching it? I believe that when we come to the end, Johnny will be able to provide you with details, but my understanding is that the link that you use to get onto this will be still available to you with the full pre-recorded thing available for you to rewatch at your leisure. So basic and traffic service, in my opinion, basic service pretty much not worth the paper it's not written on. If you're talking to somebody that's equipped with a radar, get a traffic service off them and let them tell you that they can't provide it to you, but your starting point, whether you're VFR or IFR, should be a traffic service. Basic service is not much use. Deconfliction service, my experience is that once again, that becomes a pain quite quickly outside controlled airspace. And therefore only use it if you really are mad keen to be kept clear of other traffic. But be aware that it places an enormous workload on the controllers and increasingly gives you a rather more circuitous route to get to your destination. So you may well find the traffic service is the best compromise, particularly if you're carrying something like pilot aware, or if you're carrying another form of TCAS or traffic device, the traffic service and that gives you much of the value add that a deconfliction service provides without the obligation to follow headings from a controller. Worth saying that when you're inside controlled airspace, so in Class D airspace, you will be put under what's called a radar control service. This is, in a sense, better than any of the services we've talked about, which are outside controlled airspace, because there the radar controller has you under his positive control, and you mustn't deviate from your clearance unless you have been given a clearance by the controller to do so. So outside controlled airspace, which is most of the time where IMC rating holders are going to be flying IFR, go for a traffic service. Do not accept a basic service if you can possibly avoid it, but probably avoid a deconfliction service. So finally, the kind of bit that most people regard as the tough bit of the IMC rating, which is we're going to make an instrument approach at the end of this. Let's assume this isn't one of those flights where you're just going to break through cloud at 3,000 feet and you can just continue as if you were VFR. You are in for a proper approach. Chances are that you will have one set or another of approach plates. I use Jefferson because flying internationally, it's nice to have the same format presented to you no matter which country you fly in. But you will, if you're using SkyDemon, for example, be able to see for free the instrument approach plates that are in the AIP rather, and you'll see slightly different presentation but the same information on it. Dave Buchanan asks, if you're receiving a traffic service, is the requirement to remain at a specified altitude and or request a change of level? Short answer is yes. You are effectively entering into a contract with the controller. He will look after you and you won't do anything unexpected. You don't need a clearance to make a change, but you might well say that you are now going to leave flight level 50 for flight level 30, and he will say Roger, or he will advise you that he's got traffic that might affect. So technically you don't have to stay at that level, but the deal is that you get a service, and in exchange for that you inform the controller if you're going to do anything different to what you're doing at the moment. So it's a fine point. It's not like a radar control service where you absolutely cannot deviate from the clearance you've got, because if you do, you're in violation. So the instrument approach plate, lots of interesting things here, but I listed on the left the things that I think about when I look at the approach. So something that a lot of people either don't know, forget, or were never taught is that there are different categories of approach. And if you look at that, you will see here Cat A on this Cambridge approach chart, and Cat B, and here Cat C and D. A lot of people are confused about this because they will have also heard about Cat 1, Cat 2, and Cat 3. And you would have thought someone would have come up with some better names. So Cat 1 approaches are approaches made to the usual IFR minima that we've talked about. So in the case of this plate, 550 meters, you can't go there as an IMC rating holder, but that's what the plate allows, and a 200-foot decision height, 247 on the QNH in this case. Cat 2 refers to semi-automated approaches, typically either with synthetic vision or with other forms of automatics, which are better than Cat 1. In other words, typically approaches down to a minimum of maybe 250 or 300 meters, and down to a decision height typically around 100 feet. Again, very much airliner territory here. And then Cat 3 approaches, which are subdivided further into A, B, and even C, are various versions on a theme of completely automated approaches with no visibility. It's not quite true, but you'll forgive me the generalization. So when people talk about categories of approach, they could be talking about that, but that's not what we're covering here. These approaches, as you can see, are designed with procedures that you will have flown if you've done your IMC rating already, where typically you will fly outbound from a beacon, then you'll turn at a rate 1 and you'll intercept the localizer or whatever the inbound track might be. These procedures are designed assuming that you're going to be flying them at a certain speed, and obviously your turn radius changes if you fly faster. Faster you go, the bigger turn radius you need. So to avoid having to make little slow aircraft fly huge approaches, they often will have a Cat A variant of the approach, and then a variant for, say, Cat C and Cat D. In this case, you can see that Cat A aircraft come out on a heading of 059, or a track of 059, I should say, whereas Cat C and D go out on a track of 068. This is because the categories are defined by your target threshold speed. Most light aircraft in any of us is ever going to fly will have a speed over the threshold of less than 91 knots, and that makes us Cat A. Cat B might include some of the faster twins and some of the light jets. Class C is the vast majority of airliners, and Class D included things like Concorde. So you can see why they've done it. If you're looking at minima, if you're looking at approach design, make sure you know that you're Category A, if indeed you are, and make sure that you follow the correct procedure for the category. For those of you that are lucky enough to have GPS navigators, you'll often find that the different approaches are set up as alternatives. Very easy to accidentally load the Cat D version of the approach rather than the Cat A version of an approach, and you'll find yourself flying a different approach than the one you intended. So the approach category is important to brief and understand, important to understand the minima. What do we mean by that? This approach allows us to fly, if we've got full approach lights, down to a RVR, a runway visual range of 550 meters. So 550 meters, way below the minima required if you're an IMC rating holder, but good to know that that's how the approach has been designed. And most Cat 1 ILS approaches will have a 550 meter RVR restriction. But for you, if the visibility is reported as being below 1500 meters, then that's not the approach for you. The fact that the approach may have that minimum published on it doesn't mean that you are allowed to proceed with it. Pete Berry asks a question just back to traffic services. If you are IFR in IMC conditions when contacting a last provider, they do have spare capacity for traffic confliction service. They would not have your I flight plan. So the answer is absolutely. If you have one of these I flight plans, essentially no better than a V flight plan, your last provider almost certainly will not have any information about you whatsoever. So if you're going to ask for a service, you need to start off with the same routine that you start off if you were VFR, except you may be doing it from the point of view of already being in IMC. And for some people, it's a worry not to be under some form of service if they're already in IMC, and it's not a foregone conclusion that you're actually going to get a service from them. So I think, Pete, that's your sort of observation here. There is a concern in many people's minds that if they're flying IFR in IMC and no one's looking at you on radar, aren't we just relying on TCAS, pilot aware, or big sky theory to stop bumping into other people? Pete Berry asks, can you plan a route to remain in Class D the whole way and expect it to be accepted? Or does the airway option imply the ability to enter Class A? Unfortunately, Class D typically is designed to create zones around individual airports. It's very unusual to find two airports you might want to go to for which there's a continuous Class D piece of controlled airspace. Most of the airspace above those Class D zones is Class A. So if you take a look on your charts, you'll see that all the areas around places like Clacton and Worthing are outside Class D, and they're all Class A. So unfortunately, the idea of being able to do a bounce from one Class D to another doesn't really happen because the airspace isn't structured that way. So we talked about minima. The other thing that's a thorny subject for IMC rating holders is holds. You're probably aware that the CAA has allowed this rather bizarre position to arise where actually you can get an IMC rating without ever having flown a hold in your life. And so long as one doesn't come up for real in the exam, you can get your rating issued and you've never flown a hold. And yet we could be arriving here at Cambridge, and as you can see, there's a hold at the NDB where they will put you if the approach is busy for any reason. So you're taking a bit of a gamble if you've managed to get through an IMC rating and you're not very good on holds. So it's not to preach, but rather my top tip would be if you are going to use your IMC rating seriously, and the holds are a bit of a thorny area for you, it's one where if you're looking for something to do your refresher training, go and find a good instructor and get them to refresh your memory on holds, because they do crop up, particularly flying into minor airports outside controlled airspace, like places like Gloucester and Cambridge and Cranfield. They crop up more often than you might want. Some airfields can just vector you right the way around onto the final approach course, which is dead easy, relatively speaking. And your clue is often that the approach controller actually has radar. In the case of the Cambridge approach frequency, you can see here at the top, this chart's out of date, so don't trust these frequencies. You can see the little r in brackets. This tells us that the approach controller has access to radar. Doesn't mean that the controller himself is qualified to use it at all times, but there is a possibility that when you call Cambridge approach, they will come back to you and call themselves Cambridge Radar, at which point you might well be wanting to be vectored onto the final approach course rather than flying this complex looking procedure. But you need to be aware that if there is either no radar controller, Cranfield's a good place where there is no radar there, they just have an approach service, you may well end up having to fly the full procedure without the benefit of anybody watching you on radar. And it's therefore vitally important you fly the procedure accurately, because there may be other people 1,000 feet above you in the hold or elsewhere on the procedure that you could bump into if you're not active and you're following it. So once again, if you're planning a flight in IMC and any of these things start to strike terror into your heart, that's good, because each one of these should be a deciding factor as to quite how bad the weather has to be before you decide that this is a good flight for you or not a flight for you to take. If there's a likelihood that you're going to fly or need to fly an instrument approach at the other end because cloud-based all visibility is looking a bit marginal, then you need to take a look and to understand exactly what you can and cannot get away with and what your currency will allow. And we also look finally just at missed approach and alternates. If we couldn't get into Cambridge, where are we going and is the weather any better there? Could we, for example, make a VFR landing somewhere else? Or are we marooning ourselves above cloud, never to come down? Dave Cannon asks, I understand for a full IR, you need training for PBN, PRNAV and RNAV. Is it true for the IRR that training isn't required? I have to say my understanding is that if you're going to fly a PBN approach, in other words, a GPS approach, you're going to need a specific sign-off for that. So my understanding, and I stand to be corrected, is that for the IMC rating, just like the IR, the basic rating on its own is not enough. And what people are tending to find now is that if they didn't do it first time around, when they come up for the next renewal, they're making sure that they do a GPS approach as part of the renewal, and that way they get into the club that can do them. So just be aware of that. It's also aware, particularly if you're borrowing aircraft, that to carry out a GPS approach, the GPS you're relying on needs to be IFR approved, and it needs to have the current up-to-date approaches loaded. Using an old database in your GPS is strictly verboten. So I'm not proposing to give any kind of lesson on how to fly instrument approaches, because I think you kind of know the deal there. But what I'm trying to prompt here is, what are the factors that I think about when I'm flying an approach, particularly into an unfamiliar airport, that might make me think twice about whether I'm ready for it. And that takes us very finally to personal minima, which is a concept that a lot of people are trying to promote, including the CAA, which is, it's all very well saying 1,500 meters and going, well, the law says I can do this, so I'm going to do it. The reality is that we all have factors in our lives which might mean that on any particular day, we're not going to be as sharp as we might like. And quality of training is a factor. I know many people who would be the first to admit that they had a pretty crappy training course for their IMC rating. They didn't do holds, they were rushed through it, they were kind of given the badge, and if they were ever forced to fly in IMC for real, they might crash. The I might crash rating was a popular slur used a few years ago. But there is some truth in it. A lot of people got squashed through the rating quickly on the idea that they would then learn on the job afterwards, and that's quite dangerous. So you do need to sit there in the cold light of day and think about how good your training was. Currency is another thing. How frequently have you flown a similar approach? The qualifications I put up here are what the FAA requires of its IR holders. And I've used the FAA example because the CAA doesn't publish much for IR holders as guidance. So the FAA say that if I want to exercise the privileges of my instrument rating, I have to have done 6 instrument approaches in the last 6-month window. So in other words, I have to be able to go back 6 months from today. And if I don't have at least 6 instrument approaches, doesn't matter whether they were all in the first month or all in the last month, but there have to have been 6 approaches within the last 6 months, I'm not good. And likewise, I have to log in my logbook evidence of course interceptions where I tracked a radial from a beacon or I followed a magenta line. And I have to critically have flown at least 1 hold in that 6-month period. And I have to log in my FAA compliant logbook which hold I flew and where it was. So I'm not suggesting these apply to any of us here. They apply in the FAA's mind, and the FAA operates the biggest fleet of IR registered pilots anywhere in the world. So I tend to sit up and listen to what their advice is, and it's probably good for us too. So I'm suggesting if you're going to start to fly instrument approaches on a regular basis using your IMC rating, that's not a rule, but it's a good food for thought perhaps as to how current you might want to be. Equally, precision approaches and non-precision approaches. Precision approach, once again, is an approach where you get positive guide slope guidance. For most purposes, we're talking about an ILS approach there. Non-precision is where you often have individual step-down heights, like you might get on an NDB DME or a VOR approach. It's a fact that the airlines crash far more frequently on non-precision approaches than they do on precision approaches. Where the mistake is a failure to perform an instrument approach properly, airlines almost never crash on precision approaches. They crash surprisingly frequently on non-precision approaches. They are tough. And most airports have some form of precision approach. Not all by any means, but many do. So many of us spend our life flying ILS after ILS after ILS, or until recently LPV approaches on our GPSs. And it's easy to get out of the habit of flying a non-precision approach, so that when one comes along, we can find ourselves in trouble. So perhaps in addition to thinking numerically how many approaches you've flown, how many approaches like this have I flown? And moving on to the next bullet, how familiar am I with this particular airport and the procedures that go with it? Some are harder than others. I flew into the Scilly Islands this last weekend. Fortunately, didn't need to fly an instrument approach, but they have only an NDB approach, no DME. They have an instrument approach which is entirely based on a stopwatch and the NDB. That's tough, particularly if, like me, you haven't flown one in recent times. All my NDB approaches have been proper NDB DMEs. So are you familiar with the airport? Are you familiar with the gotchas associated with the approach? That should have an effect on what minima you apply on the day. And likewise, some airfields have nasty approaches around them. We know it as VFR pilots. Places like Welshpool are harder to fly into than somewhere like Cambridge. But the fact is that terrain should feature, particularly if we're going to be in cloud. Too many people have put themselves into the side of hills by not really thinking about the terrain and the precision with which they're flying their approaches. And day and night makes a big difference as well. We've not talked about the difference between flying IMC at day and IMC at night, but those of you that are night rated will probably attest that we tend to fly less at night, so it's always a bigger workload when we're flying at night, enjoyable though it is. Flying night and IMC ramps up the pressure. So again, consider whether the entire flight is going to be conducted in daylight, whether that has a bearing on your decision making. And again, kind of anticipating a little bit David's point, RNP and GPS approaches, are we current as individuals? Have we got the right sign off? And perhaps even more importantly, when you consider the average club hack that we might have hired, does it have an appropriate IFR GPS? And has that database actually been updated in recent times? Not any GPS is an IFR approved GPS to start with. And even an IFR approved GPS becomes unapproved if it doesn't have the current database loaded. Even if it's out by one cycle, it's not, strictly speaking, IFR good. And that is something which on the odd ramp check, and they do happen very occasionally, you may be expected to demonstrate. Matt Lanham asks, if you do your IMC rating before holding a night rating and then you add a night rating later, does that automatically allow you to fly IMC at night? So the answer is yes. Night rating makes no distinction between day and night flying in the same way that the IMC rating makes no distinction between day and night. And in fact, as originally conceived, the IMC rating doesn't, or didn't, I should say, distinguish between whether you do your IMC flying in a single or a twin. So in principle, you get your IMC rating, and then if later you get your night rating, you're good to go IMC night. And I think, Matt, I don't know whether I'm anticipating your thoughts correctly, but that doesn't seem necessarily like the most sensible way forward. So this business of day or night, whether you've really flown IMC at night, whether you're really familiar with the workload that you're likely to encounter if you pile a few of these factors on top of one another, these should all contribute to personal minima. So I don't think this is exhaustive, but I'll take the last one because it's one that features regularly, which is we've all, I suspect, come under pressure because we've said to someone we're going to take them somewhere, and then we'd probably rather not because the weather's a bit crap, or we don't feel like it, or we've got a tummy bug, or we've just had an argument with our other half and we really don't feel like flying. All of these factors are what I would call situational pressure, what people sometimes call get-home-itis and some of the other sort of terminology along the same lines. Really important to be aware of that. I know it's easy to trot out, but it's true. I think doing a flight when it doesn't feel right, normally it doesn't feel right for a reason. And it's important when you consider whether you really are prepared to blast off in, let's say, 1,000-foot cloud base, or whether you're really prepared to take an approach which is going to be down to 2,000 meters viz in drizzle, whether that's really for you or not. So in no way on my part a desire to limit your ambitions. You should be as ambitious as you want to be. I'm a big advocate of properly using the IMC rating, but do it safely and be aware of these kinds of factors and perhaps others that you can think about as well that might have a bearing on how you make your minds up whether a particular flight is one for you or one to skip. That's the end of my formal show. I appreciate big time has rolled on, and I appreciate I've tried to answer most of the questions online. Johnny, do you want to bring us to a close?
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you. And going back to very early on, I had no idea about the 1500-meter viz limit. I thought, obviously, I'm not IMC rated yet, but I assumed it was a ceiling thing. But so that was quite interesting to learn.
And it's true also for the IR as well. The IR has nothing to do with cloud base. It's just the minimum you saw published on the plate or above as you see fit.
Fantastic. And we'll just say a quick all the best and good luck to Matt, who starts his IMC training on Sunday.
Yes. And thank you, David, for the kind comments as well. So, yeah, I hope this was useful. And like I said, for those of you who may have missed parts of it, I believe it's going online. And presumably, if you keep your eyes on the Flyer Club page on the website, you'll get the link.
Yeah, absolutely. The same link will work, and we'll send it out to everybody tomorrow just to remind them all. Fantastic.
Fabulous.
Right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and thank you to Nigel for that really valuable session. And we'll see you again soon for another one.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Johnny.